Okay, next on the agenda, I want to introduce Kennedy Okolo. He's our guest speaker today, and he's the Africa Regional Director for the American Friends Service Committee. He's a development practitioner with over 20 years' experience. He holds a Master of Science in Organizational Development from the United States International University in Nairobi. And you're on, Kennedy. Thank you.
Good morning, friends. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. We feel honored to be part and parcel of this meeting this morning. We feel honored to be part and parcel of this meeting this morning. And with me, we are from the American Friends Service Committee. Just before I start, I want to introduce my two colleagues that we came up with. Rather than me speak on behalf, they have voices, so I'll allow them to speak on their own behalf. So please, Moses, do you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, dear friends. My name is Moses Chassier. I work for the Burundi program of the American Friends Service Committee as a country representative. I'm glad to be among you this morning. Thank you for welcoming us.
Good morning.
Hello.
My name is Pauline Muchina. I'm from Kenya, but I am based in Washington, D.C. I am the advocacy person for AFSC on Africa issues in Washington, D.C. And I'm so pleased to be sharing this worship space with you and look forward to interacting with some of you during our stay here. And we want to say thank you again. Thanks.
Thank you, Pauline. I hope this is clear. It is clear. All right. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but also try to expound on areas that are not very clear. So before I start, I just wanted to let you know that that is the map for Africa. That is how Africa looks like. And the American Friends Service Committee is present in 4 countries in Africa. So we have a regional office there, that is Kenya specifically. And then we work in Kenya, we have a small program. We have another program in Somalia, that is Somalia, that's on the Horn of Africa. We have a program in Zimbabwe, that is Zimbabwe with Harare. And then we have another program here, which is Burundi. That's where Moses, whom we are with here, is the country representative for. So those are the 4 countries we work in. I'll be presenting on another country that we are just starting to work in, and this is this country here. It's called South Sudan. So we're starting a small program in South Sudan, which will be managed from Nairobi in Kenya. So let's move on to the slides. So thank you. So before I begin, I just wanted to say that our programs in Africa focus on 3 areas. One is working with young people. And again, I just want to mention that young people are the future of Africa. So the population below 30 years is anywhere between 60 and 70% in most of the countries where we work in. So we try to ensure that the young people, that is the youth, voices are included in all decision-making processes. And so it's very easy to cultivate that culture of peace amongst young people as future leaders of the continent. And then the other pillar where we focus on social cohesion and trauma healing for the populations that we work with. So the communities where we are present in, We do a lot of work to try to get those communities back together. One of the biggest challenges we have in the region has been the ethnic differences sometimes, because this is part of the trigger of the conflicts. We see a lot of it is from that. But also appreciating that from other conflicts also, people have had to flee from their, from their communities. And when they come back, it is important that we try and reconcile them and to try to create that sense of community to bring that back. The other thing we look at as a result of the conflicts is the issue of trauma healing. Our populations have been traumatized because of that. And so when they flee, when they come back, other than just looking at trying to look at the social cohesion, is also looking at ensuring that we look and address the traumas and that people have been through. Then finally, the third pillar of the work that we do in the region is to try to address the systemic causes of violence. And here is appreciating that conflicts are dynamic. We need to continuously be up to speed with what are the new triggers of conflict. I mean, society is very dynamic and things change every day. So within that particular pillar, we do a bit of research. We do a lot of conflict analysis. We also do focus specifically on our advocacy work. So there's what we do at the very community level, and that informs what we do at the advocacy level. The experience we have at community level informs what we want to really engage with in terms of influencing some of the structures that need to be in place in order to avoid future conflicts in the region. So that's how we work in all our programs in those 4 countries, and then the new country that we're just starting our work on. Of course, AFSC's work is supported by the many supporters for AFSC, and we do appreciate for those who continue to support us to do that work. So today, this morning, I'll briefly talk about our South Sudan program. It's a new program, and it's on trauma healing for enhanced peace building in South Sudan. I'll go through pretty fast, and if there are any clarifying questions you can ask after, I'll be happy to respond to that. So this is just a bit of a background. Sorry, technology can be very frustrating and complicated at the same time. So if this is Sudan, what I'm showing here was the larger Sudan, but in 2011, this part here became a new country called South Sudan. So we now have Sudan, the country that there have been some changes recently, and then we have the South Sudan here. So it's the world's youngest. You'll all appreciate that, but unfortunately, it is also the 4th least peaceful country in the world. It only got its independence in 2011, a population of about 11 million people. And there's been a lot of political turmoil in this particular country, pitting two different interests. The thing is, sometimes when I talk about interest or ethnicity, you also need to appreciate that there are so many underlying issues that contribute to this conflict. It's not just about people not agreeing, but there's also a lot of international interests, there are regional interests. All these contribute for us to see what is going on. So the country is so distressed. It's a lot of conflicts, forced displacements of populations, killing of civilians. In 2013 is when we started having serious problems again in South Sudan. After about 2 years of what looked like it was starting to pick up, it relapsed in 2013, and there was a lot of violence. So what has happened is the country relies on mineral oil, so fossil fuel, which contributes, it's almost like the mainstay of the country's economy. And as you can see from what we are showing there, there's a lot of the infrastructure that was already in place seems to be run down right now because of neglect, and conflict. Sorry, again, it's the technology. 65% of the population lives below poverty, high inflation rate, literacy, it's still very, very low. Institutions are still extremely weak, so governance institutions. We have so many, we have so many programs that it's begun in the country, but they've not moved on because of 2013 when it went back to the war that we are seeing right now. So infrastructures, you can see even reaching those populations can be very complicated sometimes because beyond Juba and some of the bigger towns, then the roads are quite poor. Sorry, I keep on pointing on the wrong. That's the World Food Program track, as you can see, trying to access some of those populations, but it's difficult. So that's what I was saying from 2013, civil war. A lot of people, these statistics are not really correct, but the 2 million displaced, some have fled into different countries. There are huge refugee camps in Kenya, in Uganda. A lot of South Sudanese are also all over the world. Lots of human rights violations. This is what defines really South Sudan. A lot of challenges, in the country. So let me come to what we wanted to talk about. A lot of the population is very traumatized, and it's because of the many traumatic events that the country has been through. Peace builders are also fatigued. So we have peace builders in South Sudan, a lot of people who work on peace. They're very fatigued, and part of there's the risk of them transferring their trauma to the communities that they work with. And so this is exactly where AFSC comes in, the American Friends Service Committee comes in. So even before I go to that, in 2017, one of our partners came to us who's been working in South Sudan, working with quite a number of other smaller partners in the country, and told us, look here, the challenge right now is also that there's trauma within the community, and the people who are working to support the trauma healing at community level are also struggling. And the biggest gap that we are seeing is that there's nobody to support the peace builders themselves. And so they came to AFSC and we sat together. So what happened is we decided to bring in some of the actors, some of the peace builders based in South Sudan. We brought them into a meeting in Nairobi. We have this facility we call the Dialogue and Exchange Program, and we sat together with them to try and look at what were the main issues, and also to try to verify some of what had come to us. So through the DAP meeting, this is the meeting that took place in Nairobi. This is a meeting which was facilitated by FSC. Most of these peace builders from Southern Sudan, but they also include other peace builders from other parts in the region who came in to try and share and look at what the issues were. So what we got from that meeting was that peace builders were ill-equipped with skills and resources to deal with victims of trauma and themselves. The struggle is around themselves. And then peace building organizations did not have, proper policies within their workplace environment to try to address their struggles. And so we decided that we would move into Sudan. Our main aim is to work not directly with the communities, but to work with the peace builders. And we got our supporter to support us, to help us with some initial funds and resources that now have allowed us to be able to map out the specific organizations. This is a pilot phase of this program. It's going to be a 2-year pilot phase. It's been effective October, which is this month actually, is when it's just begun. We had to wait for a while, put together proposals, things like those, and then get the initial funding to start looking at that. So we are going to work towards contributing to quality trauma healing for enhanced peace building in South Sudan. So we are targeting, and unlike many of the other actors within South Sudan, we'll only focus working at a slightly higher level, not at community level. We're only going to work with the peace builders. So what we want to do is to stop the peace builders transferring their trauma to the communities that they're supposed to be supporting. So it's sort of a secondary trauma healing program. That's what we are working on. So we're targeting organizations and individuals at the same time. Most of the organizations, these are organizations that work in peace building, so it's not every organization. As I said also, this is a pilot phase, so we are not working with so many organizations. We've just picked out 8 organizations that we'll initially be working with. And then we'll try to be looking at increasing also the capacity of peace building organizations and individuals on trauma healing. And I just want to mention that FSC partner, this is our partner in this program, is a German organization. It's called Bread for the World. Some of you might know it. And they gave us, this is about 200,000 euros, which I believe could be maybe 212 or $215,000 or something like that. For that pilot, I just want to repeat that is for a pilot phase in South Sudan. So as we speak right now, what is happening on the ground is we are doing what we call a baseline survey, just to try and gather information to look at the current state, so that as we start working, we are able to determine have we been able to contribute, and are we able to demonstrate change in the work that we are doing. So that's the program on South Sudan. Thank you very much. I have another one slide, so I don't know whether you want to maybe interact with questions right now before I go to the Kenya one and make it so easy also. All right. Okay, so we have a few questions. Yeah.
I have a little bit of an idea of how we deal with trauma in this country, because I've worked with kids that drop out of school, and I've also run a battered women's shelter. But I'm real curious over in South Sudan, how exactly do you deal with trauma? What are some of the techniques that you're using?
Okay, do you just let me. Okay.
My question was, your final statement was a question, and you said, have we been successful? I wondered what your answer was.
Sorry.
Your final statement was, have we been successful? You're the one that can answer that. I wonder what your answer is.
Okay.
Kennedy, I noticed on your first slide that you talked about a problem of being literacy, and you had a statistic. You said less than 50% of the people are literate. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of programs that you're running where you're training local people to be teachers, and these local people can work with the population. Instead of having people from other countries being the teachers, I feel really strongly that it's important that the local South Sudanese are the people that are doing the teaching. But I would wonder about teaching and what you're doing about that.
Okay. All right, maybe I can take one more and answer these ones first before I forget.
Yes, when you say trauma in a country that's been so traumatized, that still exists, and I'm wondering, how do you lift up a group of people or even one-on-one that they could exist or even see the light in the midst of all their life experiences. I'm very interested in understanding trauma. I do body work, which deals with trauma, and it's not an easy process when you have to live it day by day.
Yeah. Great questions. Let me start with, let me finish these ones, then maybe we can go to the next. I'll attempt to answer these questions because this is a new program, as I said. I kept on pointing to this word pilot. So it's a pilot. We are piloting, and we will be learning from these first 2 years of the pilot. We're supposed to report back based on the experience that we'll have gathered on the ground. We should be able either to continue with the project, or if we have not been able to be very successful, maybe we might be able to say that we cannot go on with this particular project. So this is a partnership with Bread for the World, and it's a pilot phase of this particular program. So just have that behind your minds as you ask questions. It's a pilot phase of our program. Now, you've asked about the techniques that we're going to be using for work in South Sudan. A lot of these we are bringing together. We're just starting to pull together a group of experts, to look at what really will be applicable in South Sudan. And we're going to work with, psychologists, different people with different experiences from other parts of, not just South Sudan, but from other parts of our programs, to see what is really applicable and how that is going to be applied in the context of South Sudan. This I want to link with your question, which you talk about lifting up trauma, in groups of people. It's not easy. Yes, South Sudan is already a very traumatized country. And we said, as AFSC, first of all, we can't even pretend that we can deal with the trauma in the community. So we're trying to see, to look at the gaps that really exist and how we can be able to support those ones. And that's why we are focusing specifically on the peace builders themselves and not on the community directly. So it is a challenge even for them, and if you hear the stories that they are giving us, when we have meetings, the meetings that we had in Nairobi, what people talk about is a very complex situation. It's not going to be easy, but we'll continue to work with those people and groups and organizations that have committed themselves, to continue doing trauma healing work at community level. Ours is at a very secondary level. It's just to ensure that that trauma for the peace builders is not again transferred back to the communities. Around the question of literacy, yes, it is bad in South Sudan. Again, I might not be able to respond to that directly because we are not working on education. Our emphasis within this pilot phase is just to focus on trauma for the peace builders. We might see the interactions that we have, and beyond those interactions, we will be maybe reaching out back to Bread for the World and telling them, look here, it is just beyond maybe trauma for the peace builders. Maybe you also need to think about education in this sense. You need to think about that in this sense. After this phase, I think if maybe we were to talk about in 2 years from today, I should be able to give you more information on what our experience really has been on the ground based on the findings that we've had for the peace builders. The question on successful, I didn't quite get it. Did you get it? You did. Can you respond to it?
So for when Kennedy said at the end of the program, actually the successful was coming at the end, where he said we'll be able to use some tools to determine how successful we have been. Okay, because again, as he said, this is a pilot project, And we have not yet gathered any statistics in terms of how the project has evolved. So we are going to put in place a strong monitoring and evaluation system that can enable us to track information regularly, analyzing the information, and being able to show evidence for impact. So it's a program that is just beginning, and all of this, we have had practices, lessons learned from our other programs, monitoring and evaluation efforts that we are going to be using in South Sudan. And again, it also will help us in showcasing accountability in terms of how the lives have been transformed, and also in being accountable to the donor to show how cost efficient and effective the project had been. So that's something that is going to come in the due course of time, and we will be doing this gradually through the reporting systems that we'll be putting out. Thank you.
Thanks, Moses. I think the question was based on the baseline survey, right? Sorry? Yeah, but that's a good answer. Thank you.
I wanted to say the two questions that were raised on the methods, or what we are going to be doing with the participants. First, in Africa, there is very little space for psychotherapy. So we are walking into a situation which is very complex, and we understand that. But as Kennedy said, we are looking at experts in psychology, trauma healing, on how we are going to approach this. We already had a meeting, one that was like a support group. So that was the model that was used, support group. But we know that there will be need for individual counseling, and that will also come as a result of the program after the data has been collected and after the program has actually been instituted. Thanks.
Sorry. There's a question here. There's a question here. Okay.
So please help me understand this. You're saying that right now, because the situation is so complex, you're going to be focusing on the peace builders that are going to be eventually working with people. But right now, you want to give them support so that they'll be more effective when, in fact, they do go out and deliver their programs. Did I get that right?
You're right.
Okay, so it's sort of the beginnings, the very beginning process.
It is the beginning, and I want to say that the peace builders are already working in South Sudan, so they're not new. I mean, work has been going on, so this is an identified challenge that they are facing. So it's based on the work that they're doing at the moment. But they're the ones now we are targeting. There are very few organizations. I think there was only one, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, that was also working on secondary trauma healing. So we don't have many organizations really in that space. Yeah.
We two from the same family can ask a question. My question's a more broader one than that. America has the Peace Corps and many, many other agencies that I would hope are, in this stage, are so non-political that they can provide innumerable services. Do you know of any efforts to recruit them to come in, or is it too early even for their involvement?
Good question. At the moment, I don't think even the US government would allow the Peace Corps to operate in South Sudan. It's volatile, it's risky. This is not where the Peace Corps would be operating in. I don't think they operate so much in conflict situations. They operate more in looking at long-term development, so where there's a level of stability. And South Sudan, it's not possible right now.
I'm wondering whether the United Nations is involved at all with you.
The UN is involved?
The UN, whether there's any involvement with the UN. I know my daughter worked in Sudan from 2004 to 2006, and So, I think, I wonder what has happened. I mean, I've been watching the news and all these things, but I'm seriously sort of curious what the UN is doing at all in southern Sudan.
All right, okay. I might not be able to, but I'll allow Pauline to say something about the United Nations in South Sudan. I know the UN has a big presence in South Sudan. I was showing one of the trucks that was stuck. This one, you can see that's WFP. That is the World Food Program, which is part of the UN. There's a lot of UN programs in South Sudan, including the UN Peacekeeping Mission in South Sudan. The other programs that they might be involved in South Sudan, but they're more at what I would call a multilateral level, working maybe with the South Sudan government, to try and look at this. Pauline, you want to say something about the UN? Okay, all right. Moses, you want to? Okay. The UN?
So to answer the question on the UN remains one of the actors in the country, and as such has other contributions that they will be bringing, even for the communities, as well as at that higher level. So, but one thing with our experience is that trauma healing has been a gap in most of the UN interventions and many actors. So again, the UN, when it comes to trauma healing, they rely on organizations like AFSC and other NGOs that have that expertise to see how they can complement. So as such, this program will be filling a gap that is not existing within those communities because they have been giving other support that will not be related to this. So we will make sure that we're not duplicating, but seeing how we can complement exactly on the work that is going on in that field. So it will be a best way to let the communities have higher levels of benefit. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other question, I'll try and be as brief as I can to talk about the Kenya program. So, South Sudan is a new program. Kenya, we have a program that has been ongoing for the last 6 years. This is a program that came about as a result of a lot of Quakers in the US saying that we have so many Quakers also in Kenya. The need, of course, was there, and we needed to have a program there. We have our regional office in Nairobi for AFSC. We also have the Somali program is run out of the AFSC office in Nairobi. And as I've said also, the Sudan program is going to be run out of, or managed out of the regional office based in Nairobi. So we have a small program which focuses on young people. We call it the Kenya Peaceful Youth and Communities Project. So we focus mostly on young people and Kenyan communities. We don't have a lot of funding for the Kenyan program. This is funding that has come mostly from AFSC's own funds, so we focus in a very small area in Western Kenya, and we do a bit of work also at a national level. So again, that is Kenya there. It's bordered to the north, South Sudan, to the north, Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, and then Uganda, and part of it borders the Indian Ocean. So compared to most of the neighbors, again, I want to say that it's not all gloom and doom in Africa. There are also very good things that go on in Africa. Compared to most neighbors, Kenya is relatively peaceful. But there are issues for anybody who has followed Kenya as a country. 2007, 2008, after the elections, we had what was called post-election violence, which affected quite a number of people. I think just out of that violence pitting different communities against each other, we realized that there were so many unresolved issues that the country needed to tackle before it can be able to move forward. So because of, and I just want to say, I won't go through this word by word. I wrote too much. We just needed a few. But I wanted to say that Kenya was colonized by the British. And just for information for those who are not very clear, Britain colonized so many countries in Africa. However, what we call the settler economies, the only 3 settler economies for the British, that's where they came and settled and decided they would live there. In Africa, there was only South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. That is where we had settler economies. The others were colonies, but you're colonized, but the powers are outside. But in Kenya, the Brits decided to make it home in a way, and Zimbabwe and South Africa. So the dynamics are slightly different. So because of that, the colonization and all that, there was a policy of divide and rule that was adopted, to be able to control the then so-called natives. And within that policy, what the Brits did then was, you tell this community you are so different from this community, you're so different. And because of that, it's like creating a lot of tensions. I'm saying that just to give you an idea of why we are at where we are. Communities did not have these issues prior to the arrival of the Brits. Of course, there was a bit of, those ones who kept animals, raiding another community to steal animals and things like those. But that very deep lines drawn, between ethnicity wasn't as clear as it is right now. And so what has happened is that politicians of the political class who took over after the Brits left in 1963 have continued to use that, to balkanize populations in order for them to stay in power. And that's where the problem begins. And so the problems in Kenya are very well known, but unfortunately, we do not want to address these issues. We have violence closer to elections. Then people, come back and greet each other, and then you think, okay, fine. We look like we are fine right now, so let's sweep everything else under the carpet and wait for the next elections. Again, the same problems, and again, we sweep everything under the carpet. And so it's a cyclical nature of violence. Every 5 years, we experience violence because we are not dealing with the problem itself. But also, as I said, for FSCs, the issue of ensuring that we know what the new triggers of conflict are. I just put this picture here with the dry water well here, and you can see people with their livestock, people with jerry cans, wanting to draw water, but it's dried. But it's all these things to do also with so many other things. The issues to do with the climate change right now, issues to do with, sometimes pressures of population, geopolitics, so many other things that come to play. Then I've just also talked about governance and structural violence. There's exclusion of certain sections of the community by the system, which is the winner takes it all. So if you become the president, you go in, and some of the people have been marginalizing certain sections of the country because they did not vote for that particular president. So, yeah, I've just talked about these historical injustices and grievances. Injustices over land. Again, the land issue, I can talk about it for 2 days because it's also very deeply rooted in the issue of colonialism, because when the Brits came in, they looked at those areas that were more fertile, productive. They had a climate that looked like, a bit of England, So those were the areas taken. But remember, there were people who occupied that land before their arrival, and they had been displaced. So this has never been properly addressed in the country, and that's why we see the conflicts. There are people who still feel they need to go back to their land. Electoral violence, I've talked about it, and then marginalization of communities. This picture I've just put as a result of 2008, 2009, so it's not a recent picture. Things are much better right now. That was when people were displaced from their land, and so these were internally displaced persons, just trying to rebuild. The effects of what I've just been talking about is that you get the economy being affected because of lack of foreign direct investment in the country. There's still populations that are traumatized. And then social cohesion. These are things we need to deal with as a country. And then the vicious cycle of violence that the community finds itself trapped in every 5 years. If you go in right now, is peaceful like any other place you can get to in the world, But come 2022, when the next elections are closer, then the politicians take advantage of this and use all necessary means to try and, win the elections. So again, I won't talk about all this, but I wanted to say that, I won't talk about all this, but I just wanted to talk about our program in Kenya itself. The reason I'm leaving this here is just because of the NPP, which is the national peace policy that has been adopted in the country. A lot of the work that AFSC has been doing is in two places. There's work that has been that takes place at a community level, mostly in Western Kenya. We work with a number of Quaker organizations, and what they've been doing is to look at reconciling communities through community dialogues, working with young people in schools and in tertiary institutions. We've been using the AVP approach, in terms of ensuring that, we are getting all these young people think about peace and appreciate how they can contribute to peace, at a very individual level. We've also been escalating that and using, helping increase the peace programs at community level. So we use a lot of those Quaker tools which were developed some years back, I think, here in the US. And between the different communities, we've been bringing them together to sit together, talk about what the issues are, to try to address them, understand, what it is that they are struggling with. At the same time, those sessions can also be very therapeutic in a way, So you're talking to somebody that you've always thought has always been your enemy, but they're not actually enemies. This has mostly been on the borders of the different regions. Why we target young people and people in schools is because we want to cultivate that culture of peaceful reconciliation of conflicts at a very early stage. The struggle right now has been the permission to be able to work in primary schools. So the Ministry of Education had its own reservations about organizations working with young people in school, although it tried to introduce peace as a subject in the schools. So we have been working with a few universities. As I said, again, we are not very well resourced, to be all over. So we only have to work where we are able to work. And what FSC also has been doing is, based on the information we gather at that level, and that's why I was pointing at this NPP, we have been, at a national level, FSC mobilized the peace-building organizations under a forum that we call the Kenya Peace Conference. Now, this platform, we've been using it to try and influence policies so that we can address some of this cyclical nature of violence, in the country. And so through the Kenya Peace Conference, KPP, in 2015, the various organizations that are part of the KPC process managed to push the government to adopt a peace policy in the country, which is called the National Peace Policy. These are the abbreviations there. So we have now a national peace policy. We would like this to become law, and so at the moment there is a lot of work, it's a lot of advocacy work that has been ongoing, trying to talk with members of parliament and to try and get this become a bill at the National Assembly. So there's a lot of work. This is informed also by the experience from the ground, not just for AFSC, but it includes a number of other organizations that we are working in. So this really was a very good move for AFSC. So the program, September 2012, is effectively from 2013. So it's just empowering young people to be agents of peace and reconciliation in their communities. And as I said, we use, I think most of us know the AVP as a tool. Then ensuring that we also support youth organizations, that they have the capacity, to continue participating in peace-building processes. And then the third aspect is what I've just said, which is to improve coherence, coordination, and synergy among peace-building organizations. And that's what I said is what we have called the Kenya Peace Conference, which is a platform. We bring together all the different peace actors in the country. So I think I've just said everything around that. This picture was a bit misplaced, not that the lady, they were arguing about anything. But these are some of the community dialogues and forums that we are talking about, where we bring the different communities, together to sit and really appreciate each other, try to address what is going on. Yeah, so we bring in the gender aspect in all our programs. We include young people and also women and men. African countries can be very patriarchal in nature, and so we have to ensure that continuously we have, all the genders included in that. I'll allow for a few questions in relation to that.
I want to make sure that everyone knows that we have a literature table out here in the hall with a lot of wonderful materials about AFSC's programs in Africa and some other places. You mentioned the work, that much of the work is around peace building. Can you talk about the idea of shared security and how you're trying to bring people together with that concept? And maybe also mention the new book, Indivisible.
Okay. All right.
You've talked in both pieces of your talk about peace builders, and I think it would just help us to have you sort of name some of the kinds of peace builders that you're talking about.
You mentioned that the culture or society, it tends to be rather patriarchal in a number of countries in Africa, and women are typically not thought as being, you're usually not as much educated as the boys are. When you're building your plan for the peacemakers, are you building literacy for the girls into the plan so they can participate in the peace building? That's one, I guess. And the other would be, once you actually train the youth to be people going out and working in conflict, how do you provide for their safety as they go into places and work with people in reducing conflict and addressing deep-seated kinds of things? Are you dealing with processes for people where people will speak differently about violence? It's not just the differences themselves, but how are we going to address that? That's it.
Okay. Great, thanks. So shared security. Shared security is one of AFSC's framework for doing its work, and it is based on, for us in Africa, we say it's based on the Ubuntu philosophy as espoused by Bishop Desmond Tutu, for those of you who might have heard of him. And it goes on to say that you are because I am, and I am because you are. So it is about that the world's challenges or the problems that we face cannot be resolved by any one person. We need to look at it jointly and try to address in a way that ensures that it's a win-win situation, is not one win and one lose. And if I'm not safe, you are not safe. If you are not safe, I'm not safe. So it is a shared sort of arrangement. Shared security is also around the work that we do to challenge some of the dominant narratives on militarism, the different approaches that have been traditionally used to address issues of conflict and violence in the world. Where the responses have always been that if there's violence somewhere, the only way to resolve that conflict is by placing what we call boots on the ground. There are different ways that have worked, and there are so many of these traditional ways that have not also worked. And it's also around shifting the narrative around militarism, and that's what shared security is about. So as a region, our emphasis, which I didn't mention maybe because of time, we have a theme that has been, which we adopted as a region, which is on prevention of electoral violence. That is our main theme for us under the shared security framework that we've been addressing. We've done a bit of research to look at really what works in terms of prevention of electoral violence. We've looked at different case studies of countries where we've had violence and maybe that has been deterred. We are using the same to share with other countries. We just carried out a research that took us in about 4 countries. That was, there was Kenya, there was Malawi, we used Sri Lanka also as a country, and Sierra Leone. So we have that information. If you'd like to have a look at that, it's possible to have a look at that. So the other one that, Linda, you talked about is the book Indivisible, which brings out all these. I don't know whether we have it on the table here, but it pulled together different voices talking about shared security, and it was pulled together by our Associate General Secretary here in Philadelphia, Kerry Kennedy, together with an author, I think she's called Ruth Freeman. I think that's the name. So that's the shared security aspect of our work, and it brings out our. We try to get what we are getting at community level to escalate that into the policy space at a national level, at a regional level, and at an international level. So we collaborate with our other organizations associated with us. At UN level, there's the Quaker United Nations Office. Our voice at DC, and Pauline is here, she's based in DC. She brings all this education and, to try to sensitize people on the issues that are taking place in the region. So that's what our shared security is about. Some of the peace builders that we work with, there are quite a number of other organizations that are involved in peace building that we work with. I don't know whether you wanted specific names or... Okay. All right. So the approach that we use as an organization is we work through partnerships. So we have partners who are really grounded or who are really right on the ground that we support in various ways. So we support in terms of improving their capacity to be able to go about doing the work that they do. Some of the funding that we get also goes to these particular partners, and then we work with them throughout, so that is part of what we call accompaniment. So we accompany them in all that journey. In terms of even fundraising or looking for funds, we ensure that their voices are heard and they're part and parcel of that. So it's really not about AFSC being different from these partners. We walk this journey together, so we move around with them throughout. Some of them are very local. We have different types of partnerships. We have those ones that are very community level. There are those ones we just collaborate with, around information. There are those ones we want to have campaigns with, in terms of influencing policy. So it really varies, but it's different organizations that we work with. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so some of the people that we work with directly is like youth leaders from particular communities, because they are influencer in their own platform. The women's movement also, specific communities in South Sudan, we also do that. We also look at the elders or the leaders of a community, because they weigh a lot of power in terms of influencing their community, and we bring them to the table. And so then there are organizations that provide, that are doing development work. There are different organizations that are also doing specific work on trying to end conflict in specific communities. So we also have them in the program. Thanks.
Thank you. So Jake, your question was on patriarchal literacy of girls. That's what you asked? That's right, and and you're right about that, because gender for us is something that cuts across everything that we are doing, all the programs that we are running. We have to try to ensure, we have to ensure that there's a level of gender parity, and it's not just about wanting to include, let's say, women for the sake of having the numbers or statistics there. It's really trying to ensure that that voice of, the women and the girls, is heard in all these conversations. And sometimes it's not really even about literacy, because many of these African communities, they had their own traditional methods of approaching issues and resolving conflicts, some of which many of the programs sometimes we put in place tend to overlook, yet they are very rich, very good ways, to resolve conflict. And, women voices in certain aspects sometimes were included, and what we are trying to do is just to ensure that there is a continuation of ensuring that women remain part and parcel of this movement. I was going to give an example of, in some of the communities, when the young men went out to raid, and maybe it could be animals, steal from the other community. When they came back home after raiding and doing all that had happened out there, they come back home, and who welcomes them? It's actually the women who will be, singing great songs, things like those. So we have to ensure that the voice of the women is there, but also in terms of the influence the women have, like mothers, on these young people as they go out to do all these things. We cannot ignore the women, in peace-building efforts, especially at a very local community level. So that's very critical for us. In terms of safety for young people going to do work in maybe conflict situations, as I said, one of the things that, we are a responsible organization, so we are not going to put anybody in harm's way, we have to ensure that their safety comes first. And so before we get into processes where young people have to go out, the organizations that our partner organizations, I think we must have taken people through all these processes. So if we are calling for, let's say, community dialogues between the different communities, that must take place before any other work can follow. So we'll have to assess and weigh the situation before anything else would follow. And most of the reconciliation work will be by the partner organization. I think the young people starting to talk about it will be at a later stage, and it will be after working with both the different communities, to ensure that there's a level of stableness. But I also want to say that in the case for Kenya, it is not that bad. it's not, there's a level of law and order. So it's not easy for somebody. Well, there are cases where people could be attacked of being of a different ethnic group. But when we are not close to elections like today, for instance, you will not see that. So it's not something that you're going to experience. Thank you.